So really, what are the 8 tones anyway? Are they melodies? Are they a set of rules? Are they a sequence of chords? And why are there 8 of them, and why not, say, 3 or 7 or 50? And why do we have to use them in church? Why do there have to be 8 tones at all? There seems to be lots of music not in any of the 8 tones, at least in the Russian tradition, so why can't all church music be like that? To start answering some of these questions, it might help for a moment to use another common word for tone, which is mode. For the ancient Greeks, who gave the world its first really organized theory of music, a mode was, first and foremost, a scale. And that's what the word means in Western music theory as well. The basic idea of mode as scale is a helpful thing to keep in mind at this point. And what's a scale? The word comes from the Italian word scala, which means ladder or stairs. It's a collection of pitches dividing up the octave, 8 pitches to be exact, or rather 7, with the 8th being a repetition of the first, an octave higher. In modern Western music theory, there are really only 2 scales, or 2 modes, major and minor. But for the ancient Greeks, there were as many as 13 different modes, or even 15 by some counts, each with its own distinctive character and vocal range. But more than just being a collection of pitches within an octave, the ancient modes also carried with them their own set of musical gestures and motifs typical of that mode. In a way, then, a mode was really a manner or style of making music. The best modern equivalent might be certain blues scales, which are, of course, scales, but which also presuppose certain characteristic ways of using those scales. Even more than this, though, modes were, for the ancients, representations of certain states of the soul, and even microcosms of the structure of the cosmos. Plato, for example, talks in the Republic about the effects of certain modes on the good order of the state, and posits that only 2 modes, the Dorian and the Phrygian, should be permitted, lest a host of undesirable tendencies creep into the populace by means of the corrupting effect of certain modes. He also talks in another dialogue about how the ratios between notes in a given mode are reflected in human physiology and even in the orbits of the planets. Pythagoras fleshes out some of those ideas in detail in his concept of the music of the spheres. As ancient Greek music theory evolved in the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe during the first millennium of Christianity, these ideas about modes as both manners of music making and cosmological principles still held sway, continuing even to the European Renaissance and beyond. Johannes Kepler's influential 1619 work, Harmonices Mundi, literally Harmony of the Worlds, is one of many examples of how these ancient ideas manifested themselves in European thought. The beginnings of the 8 tones, or modes, as a Christian liturgical concept are found in the monastery of St. Sabas in Palestine in the 6th and 7th centuries, though the idea may have originally come from Jerusalem a century earlier. The monks there organized the liturgical calendar into an 8-week cycle based on 8 musical modes, and monastic hymnographers there composed hymns to fit the scheme. The Sabite system was formally adopted by the Church in the Quinisext Council of 692, and it's this system that forms the basis of the cycle we use today. So why just 8 modes and not 13, like the ancient Greeks? Well, the idea of 8 modes is actually a little misleading. In Byzantine music theory, there are really only 4 fundamental, or authentic modes: first, second, third, and fourth, and then various permutations on those modes. The main permutation of any mode in Byzantine music theory is called a plagal, a kind of transposition of the mode. Thus, 4 authentic modes plus 4 plagals get us to 8 modes in all. Now, this idea of 4 modes and 4 permutations wasn't unique to Byzantium. The ancient Greeks thought in terms of 4 basic modes as well, and all the permutations of those got them to 13 total modes. But the most basic permutations of any mode involve 2 sets of 4 notes, tetrachords, stacked one on top of the other, comprising an octave, and thus creating 8 modes in common usage. Our Western scales are constructed pretty much the same way, even if we might think of them a little differently. The idea of 4 basic modes was pretty fundamental. In the ancient mind, it was connected with the concept of 4 fundamental elements, earth, water, air, and fire, as well as with the idea of 4 bodily humors, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, a concept that governed the practice of medicine all the way up to the modern era. These 4 basic modes were understood to be the foundation of all the others, just as the 4 elements combine to form the rest of the material cosmos. It should be starting to become clear at this point. When we're talking about the modes, we're actually talking about a whole system of music theory, a whole cosmology even, and not just specific formulas within it. In the Greco-Roman understanding, the 4 authentic modes were essentially the matrix of all music, the generating principles from which music sprang. For them, there wasn't really anything that could be called music outside of this system. The idea of composing music in something that was not a mode was basically nonsense. In a very real way, then, when the Sabite monks created a system of hymnography based on the 4 modes and their 4 main permutations, we can see it as a kind of representation of all music, and not just a limited subset of it. Rather than simply restricting music to only, say, 2 basic modes as Plato would have done, we are seeing the church accepting of really the whole gamut of musical possibilities, at least as far as they were understood in the Greco-Roman world of the 7th century. This is not to say there weren't limits. One major limit was the idea of vocal modes versus instrumental modes. For the ancient Greeks and Byzantines alike, these were actually 2 distinct, though closely related, theoretical systems. The Sabite monks naturally used the vocal modes since they were composing hymns to be sung, not melodies to be played on instruments. The other limit was the hymns themselves, as preserved and passed down to us in the anthology known as the Octave, or Book of 8 Tones, though only the text of this work survives today. It was this particular collection of hymns, and not a set of abstract musical principles, that formed the foundation of the musical system of the church. Every hymnographer afterwards based their work in some way on the Octave, thus giving it canonical status, if you will. This is a really important point to keep in mind. The musical tradition of the church is largely a tradition of particular works by particular artists created within a particular cultural context, which over time have gained authority insofar as they have influenced other works by other artists in other contexts. It is not, in essence, a set of rules or formulas. The system of 8 tones can therefore be understood in some sense as both allowing boundless creative exploration in one's given cultural context, while at the same time requiring creative artists to be guided by the most influential works that have immediately preceded them. In short, the 8 tones are more like a language than anything else. And this is the best way to understand how the 8 tones have come down to us today in the Russian tradition. The biggest problem for church musicians singing services in Slavonic in the early years of Slavic Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries was, for obvious reasons, the problem of translation. How to sing anthologies of Greek hymns, nearly all of which were carefully metered in some way in an entirely different language, with entirely different stress patterns and numbers of syllables, and in an entirely different cultural and musical context. If you want to get a sense of what this might feel like, minus the different language and cultural context, try singing the Pledge of Allegiance to the tune of Happy Birthday. The solution in some places, it seems, was just to keep singing services in Greek, at least for a while, kind of like what we've done here in America. However, as more and more of the liturgical cycle got translated into Church Slavonic, and as new generations took up the work of organizing and performing hymnography, the inevitable result was A, an increasing separation between the text and the music, and B, an evolution of the musical element itself. Think of it this way. You're charged with translating a metered Greek hymn into Slavonic, and, as much as possible, preserving the original melody as it has been handed down to you. But your Slavonic text just won't fit the Greek meter, at least not without doing violence to the meaning of the text. So you go for meaning rather than meter. Already you're separating text from music, and then you try to reapply the original melody to the new text. But now that the meter has been lost, you have to reconceive the melody. So you pull motifs that seem important to you out of the original melody, and then you connect them to one another as best you can. You might repeat notes when you end up with extra syllables, as was often the case in Slavonic, and leave other ones out when you didn't need them. Also keep in mind that this process was often done without musical notation, just by ear, so there was lots of room for inconsistencies. There's really no better recipe for creating a new musical system in a relatively short period of time. And that's just what happened in the Slavic Church. From the very beginning, it became necessary to think of music and text independently, and to think of the 8 tones as, rather than an anthology of hymns, a collection of musical motifs with a parallel collection of texts, organized by tone, because that's how they were organized in Greek. And tone here is now little more than a name, a chapter heading in a book, because its musical meaning has changed, or was really never understood in the first place. The tones themselves, therefore, become a kind of grab bag of musical motifs that get applied to a text according to certain norms. Each tone has its characteristic gestures and rules, but the differences between one tone and another were mostly arbitrary and purely formal. Tone had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to mean mode in terms of distinct musical scale within a coherent theoretical system. In early Russian chant, Mnemonic chant and its relatives, the tones were complex sets of motifs, which would be applied to text syllable by syllable. This allowed for a good deal of musical expression, but since the tones were complicated and afforded an enormous range of possible variations, hymnography often had to be either improvised on the spot by expert singers or carefully notated, or a combination of both. And keep in mind that musical notation in the Middle Ages was basically just a system of mnemonic symbols designed to remind singers of formulas they were already supposed to know. No wonder, then, that it was the norm in the early centuries of Russian church music for most hymnography to be performed by specially trained soloists. Only, really, in monasteries, where there was ample opportunity for groups of singers to all learn the niceties of the tones by sheer repetition, was ensemble singing of hymnography very widely spread. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, for a host of reasons we don't have time to go into here, the Ukrainians and Russians started singing in choirs in church more and more frequently. One result of this remarkable development was that the tones began to evolve into melodies that were simpler and more predictable, making them easier for groups of singers to perform at sight. Thus was born the body of chants known as Kievan, Greek, and Bulgarian chant. They're all Slavic in origin, though. And these chants form the basis of what we now know in the Russian tradition as the 8 tones. It's these melodies, in the forms in which they've come down to us today, that we are going to learn. These 8 tones are pattern melodies that are almost infinitely adaptable. The patterns are applied to a text phrase by phrase, rather than syllable by syllable, and the number of possible motifs is greatly reduced from what it would have been in medieval Russian chant. The phrases repeat in a fixed and predictable order, and they have recitation tones in the middle of them, a flexible series of repeated notes that allow for pretty much any number of syllables in a phrase. It's easy to see how useful this approach would have been for allowing groups of singers to set hymnography to music at sight without the need for musical notation. However, it also had, and continues to have, a kind of steamroller effect on musical expression. So it's likewise easy to see why the Russians felt the need to compose lots of other liturgical music that didn't have anything to do with the 8 tones. Because you remember, the Russians never really understood the 8 tones or modes in the way the Greeks did. That is, as an all-encompassing musical language, beyond the bounds of which there really wasn't such a thing as music. For them, as for us now, the 8 tones are simply the received manner of setting certain kinds of texts to music, Sekira, Triparia, Perkimena, etc., but they are by no means a representation of all musical possibilities. Quite the opposite, in fact. Having said this, though, I think it's important for us today to learn the 8 tones as we've received them. And here are 2 reasons why. 1, the normal alternative to singing the 8 tones is, in most Russian tradition parishes, simply having a solo reader read these texts in a monotone, as is done with psalms during the hours, for example. The more we do this, the less vibrant and dynamic, the less beautiful our services become. Singing hymnography as an ensemble, especially on feast days, is surely better than just reading it. It is, of course, possible to come up with other more satisfactory solutions. This kind of creativity is an interesting and exciting development in the tradition. But the lowest common denominator tends to be just reading the hymnography, and that's a shame. And 2, as we mentioned earlier, the musical tradition of the Church doesn't evolve according to abstract rules, but it evolves out of a particular work and particular practices. Whether we like it or not, the 8 tones as we've received them are a deep and long-standing part of our liturgical experience. If we want a solid and beautiful new branch of the tradition to evolve in our own context and language, we have to internalize, at least to some extent, what has come before us. In other words, if we want to continue the musical tradition, we have to first become a part of it. And learning the 8 tones is a clear way to do that. To use our metaphor from earlier, if we want to write new works in the musical language of the Church, we first have to learn that language as it is currently spoken. So, let's learn the 8 tones. But then, let's see where we go from there.